comes way before, really, we've had those kind of protocols way before we've had the Monroe reports. I must say, as yet, I haven't seen any effect whatsoever, really.
So it's back to resources.
Back to resources, exactly.
So often you
Can you perhaps just explain for anybody who doesn't quite know what the public law outline is, so that we can get a bit sense of what's happening?
It's a protocol. It's a set of regulations, I suppose, a kind of a tool as to how we're going to deal with public law proceedings. You start with a pre-proceeding stage where, before social workers are even thinking about bringing a case to court, there are certain steps that they need to take, and then they'll inform parents where they feel that they're failing of their concerns. They'll send them a letter, they'll be invited along to a meeting with their lawyers. You get into court, and then there are steps that are given in terms of timescales by which certain hearings should take place, and essentially it's brought in a procedure, really, for hearings to take place in the life of a case. And one of the aims of the public law outline was to try and have cases concluded within 40 weeks. Well, I think we know that we have yet to see a case that's concluded in 40 weeks. So.
Right, very few.
Okay, and one of the things that we were talking about earlier before we came in here was there's been quite a high profile in the media, certainly in Parliament discussions, particularly about adoption, and the Department for Education's had a group running looking at adoption and talking about the benefits of speeding that up. When we're talking about adoption, we're primarily these days talking about children who've been through the care process and needing to get to that stage. I think we may well be looking at some legislation in the not too distant future on that, given that it impacts directly upon sort of the areas that you're working in. What are the things that you think we really need to be bearing in mind when we're looking at trying to place children for adoption more quickly? There's the issue, obviously, of getting through the care proceedings to a point where you can do that, but there's also, I think, an implication that perhaps there ought to be more risks being taken in the sense of placing children who you think are going to be adopted at an earlier stage with parents who might start to look after them before you actually get to the end of the care proceedings. I mean, I can think of all sorts of issues.
I'm aware of that, and I think it's another project that's been ongoing on the South Coast, but of course that has enormous emotional consequences on either side, particularly for potential adopters, because if a young baby is removed from mother for whatever the reason, and we're in the middle of care proceedings, and that child is then placed with Mr. and Mrs. A on the basis that you'll look after this child for 6 months, but at the end of the case, if the court decides the child should go back to his birth mother, you've got to say goodbye. And that has got to be heart-wrenching for a couple who have gone through all of the hurdles to be approved as adopters. So I can see enormous advantages for the child if the court says that the child shouldn't go back to his or her birth family, but huge consequences if not. And I agree that when one has to consider risks and different ways of approaching this, but you've also really got to be very, very careful in making those decisions on whether that it's right to place that child with that particular couple, because they're human beings, and this is also not a science. This is
if you've got a child and you don't know whether they're going to stay with you or not,
how can you invest emotionally fully?
How do you react and behave towards that child? And then I think we come on to bring in sort of the science issue. I mean, you mentioned the case before about the children who are wrongly diagnosed or whatever in terms of issues, and therefore assumptions are made that these parents may have done X, Y or Z, but in actual fact it's some other issue that subsequently comes up.
I was going to rewind actually, Meg, just before we dealt with that point, and that's going back to adoption, and that is that, I mean, an awful lot of children remain in good quality foster placements, and there's an awful lot to be said about good quality foster caring, that where if a child can't be adopted, and a lot of placements where children are adopted by the foster carers. So, sorry, I wanted to bring back to the table, because adoption is absolutely the best outcome for a young child where there is no security, etc., with a family. But there are a lot of children where you can have good security for them in a foster placement. And a lot of professionals have that thinking, so I just wanted to bring that to the table.
And I think always the dilemma there is and it's kind of dilemma you have. I've chaired foster panels and fostering panels and adoption panels in the past. If you've got a couple coming forward for fostering who are childless, there's sometimes I think a bit of an unhealthy suspicion that are they really trying to do it? Yes, and the terminology, are they trying to do it through the back door? Yet if we're looking at the welfare of the child, if they're trained and supported as foster parents, and yet
there can be deep suspicions.
They subsequently end up adopting. If that's the right thing for the child, maybe that's something that we shouldn't so much frown on.
Yeah, the other danger that it seems to me is quite often, certainly when you're representing parents, it's very difficult to get them and their wider family to think about whether the child could be placed somewhere else in the family at an early stage, because when the parents are still not accepting that they've caused some problems or that their parenting has been problematic in some way, they and their family tend to close doors around the parent, sort of almost like an effect of saying, well, we're going to defend the case because there is a legal case going on. It's something that they see that they have to defend themselves from. And so then the wider family members don't necessarily come forward at the stage in the case where we would like to see this happen. Yes. This happens time and time again in court, and we always, as the lawyers, we always get told off for, why didn't you put this person forward beforehand? And it's not always that simple. There's a whole thing going on in families behind the scenes that we don't necessarily see. And at the 11th hour, somebody comes forward, there's an auntie or there's a cousin or somebody who might actually be quite a good carer for this child. Now, if you've already placed children with somebody who could potentially adopt them, you're going to get decisions being made potentially on the basis of, well, it's quicker to keep them there now and you're a bit too late, whereas actually they could have been brought up in their birth family. It's all a bit tricky.
What about, the classic cases where people say this should happen more often is perhaps where you've had older children adopted and you've gone through quite a complex care proceedings, but everybody's at the end of it is deemed that this is the best interest for maybe, as you said, the kind of issue you had before. Somebody's been alcoholic, or they've got a drug use problem, or they continually have partners who are risk to children, and then another child is born and nothing much has changed. Now, I know there's always a judgment about nothing much has changed, but in those circumstances, shouldn't we be moving more quickly to place children?
I don't think courts are afraid at all to take make really robust decisions about whether or not further assessments are going to be needed, and in effect extend care proceedings unnecessarily, where a newborn baby who's has an umpteen number of siblings who've already been received into care. But one has to look at each case very carefully, because there may be a new partner, maybe the drug addict mother has a new boyfriend, one hasn't explored his family or what he has to offer. Does he, with her, improve her levels of parenting, that they can provide good enough parenting for the child? So, yes, there are lots of good reasons to be really robust, and I can think of a number of cases where I've acted for siblings upon siblings of children from the same parents, where the courts do look very carefully and think, now, do we really need a psychological report in 2012? We had one in 2011, and there was one in 2010, and there was a parenting assessment in 2009. No, what has changed? And let's really look at it. And I think that goes back to what Monroe and delay and trying to really think about where and if an expert is necessary. And I'm in favour of that.
Yeah, I think
from the child's point of view.
That's absolutely right. Absolutely right. There has to be some decision making in the actual court process about whether further assessments are necessary. But the alcohol hair strand testing case I dealt with, she had 3 or 4 children removed from her previously in previous years, and so you can never definitely make that decision. That never say never, exactly.
And one also you also have to take into account you've got the human rights legislation as well, and the parents' right to a fair trial. Goes back to what I said earlier in this discussion. We're not just talking about whether somebody goes into custody for a few months. Whether somebody goes into custody for years. You're looking at the potential permanent separation of the child, and the child's right as whether or not he or she should be allowed to remain in the birth family. And it comes down to the parents saying, I need to have a fair trial.
And do you think actually there's enough understanding more widely of the implications for adopted children of being brought up in other families and how they might feel about that? And I think there's always a real dilemma here, because you have people who've been placed for adoption who've had a very good experience, who maybe don't see beyond that there are other people who, despite having been put with perfectly good parents who've given them a good experience, nevertheless always feel that they're in the wrong family.
I mean, Laura, I don't know what you feel, but as the child solicitor, if I'm a guardian, I'm working with a children's guardian who is the person who gives me the instructions, particularly for very, very young children. We want to see that in 2012 that everything was done possible so that when that little boy or little girl grows up and they look back on life story work, they can say everything was done to see if I could stay with my mum and dad. And I think that it's enormously important for a child in an adoptive placement, and more important for some children than perhaps others, depending on the experience they've had with their adoptive families. So again, there are always a number of cases that come back of failed adoptions. I think you have to look very carefully at the matching process, and again, it comes back to it's down to the judgment of the social worker who makes the matching decision. It's down to the child. Was it right for that child to be adopted? There are so many
absolutely.
imponderables.
Absolutely. I mean, I represent children as well, and I completely echo what you say about that. I think it has become slightly politically thought that adoption is some sort of panacea for these children, and it isn't necessarily the case. And it's a difficult one. Difficult. There needs to be some more evidence-based research, I think.
Always more evidence, which gives me an opportunity to bring back the scientist in there. Given that extra pressure there seems to be coming, for good reason, to move things more quickly and maybe to have the answer, as it were, maybe to find a thing which says, yes, absolutely, this child clearly can't stay at home or whatever. How do you think, not necessarily from your particular areas, but from your colleagues who perhaps are providing evidence into childcare cases as such, how do you think that will impact upon the work?
Well, I think that those colleagues who deal with those types of tests recognise the impact that their results can have, and it's very important that they are aware of that. We go back to the original issue, aren't we, of whether it should be a case that's dealt with solely by experts, and I don't think it is. I think they all recognise that their little bit of the evidence fits into a certain place in that trial or in that case, but it shouldn't just be taken by itself in isolation. It has to be viewed within the context of the other information in the case, and that's very important. What would you say?
No, I agree with you, Sue. I think certainly there are moves afoot within forensic science generally to proceed with work much more quickly. I mean, I have dealt with a number of cases which have directly impacted on sort of fostering or adoption, and luckily I received feedback via the police and other parties about what they were doing at their end to progress the situation. So that obviously meant that I could actually sort of provide input and say, well, it's going to take a bit longer, or we've got these results that we might be able to help you with, or unfortunately I won't be able to help you. But I think in a lot of cases, it comes down to communication and all parties being aware of what the requirements for everybody else is, and I think maybe we need to make that, or do a better job of that.
Deep question now coming up. What's happening in terms of forensic science things? What are the kind of things now which maybe you can give us information on in terms of this sort of decisions that might be made? This is just sort of blue sky thinking here for me, in terms of stuff that we might not have known about 10 years ago. We've talked about hair strand tests, which provide information about things over a period of time. We always used to wonder about, had somebody been visiting the home when they weren't supposed to, and I remember having outrageous discussions with people about whether we should actually, as social workers, be hiring effectively private eyes to find out what somebody was up to, which didn't seem terribly ethical to me at the time. What are you able to do now which you couldn't do 5-10 years ago?
What are the cutting edge developments? Well, certainly starting with DNA, which is always the place to start, I think.
Well, that was the thing that helped you in the first place, so I expect that.
Judging from people's interests on TV as well, it's a whole lot more sensitive than it used to be. When DNA profiling first started, we needed a significant amount of body fluid to give a DNA profile, probably around about a 10-pence piece size blood stain. Now we can obtain a DNA profile from something that's just been handled. Not always. There are various factors that feed into that, but these are the levels of DNA that we're talking about. but that in itself brings other limitations to the technique, because you are limited as to being able to say perhaps how that DNA was deposited, what is it from.